Welcome to the debate.
Today, we're looking at a really foundational shift in American government, the 20th Amendment, ratified back in 1933.
That's right. And this amendment, it fundamentally changed the timeline for presidential power, specifically moving the inauguration date from the old date, March 4th, up to January 20th.
Which sounds simple, but it drastically cut down that waiting period between the November election and the new president actually taking office, down from about 16 weeks to, 11 weeks now?
Exactly, 11 weeks. And the core question we're wrestling with today, based on the source material, is this. Did the 20th Amendment really fix the dangers of those long transition delays? Or does that remaining 11-week period actually leave modern governance, critically short on time? I'm going to argue that shortening the transition was, well, not just necessary, but actually sufficient. It managed the key constitutional risks and basically eliminated that dangerous power vacuum.
And I'll be taking a different view. While, yes, getting rid of that archaic 16-week gap was absolutely essential, I'm going to argue that the 11 weeks we're left with is, frankly, just too tight for how complex the executive branch is today. It leaves new administrations vulnerable to, well, predictable mistakes rooted in haste and maybe a bit of inexperience, essentially trading one kind of crisis for another.
Okay, well, to really understand why I say the 20th Amendment was a success, we have to look back at the kind of crises it was meant to stop. That old 4-month lame duck period, it often created this really dangerous interlude of national impotence, as the sources call it.
Right.
Think about two key examples. 1860, Lincoln gets elected. The nation is literally falling apart. States are seceding. Yet for 16 weeks, the president-elect was literally completely powerless to act. You still had Buchanan in office, and the government was just paralyzed.
A terrifying scenario.
Exactly. And then fast forward to 1932, the absolute depths of the Great Depression. FDR wins with this huge mandate for the New Deal, but he can't take office until March 4th of the next year. The country is just economically adrift for 4 critical months. So the main goal, and the Senate Judiciary Committee was clear about this, was to get rid of that long, dangerous gap that, frankly, modern communication and transportation had made obsolete anyway. Moving the date to January 20th, that solved the constitutional paralysis, period.
Okay.
But the fix, it actually goes deeper than just the inauguration date. The amendment also moved the start date for the new Congress to January 3rd. Now, why does that matter? Well, it meant that if a presidential election ever got thrown into the House of Representatives, which the Constitution allows for, the choice would be made by the new members of Congress, the ones just elected, not by, as the report called it, a repudiated house of lame ducks who'd already lost their seats. That democratic fix, just on its own, really underscores the amendment's success. The 11 weeks we have now, it balances the need for prompt action with the fact that, yes, transferring power is incredibly complex, but it gives enough time if it's managed well.
I absolutely agree that the crises you mentioned, 1860, 1932, were existential. And yes, that March 4th date was archaic, it had to go. But I'm sorry, I just don't buy that 11 weeks is truly adequate for planning and running the modern federal government machine. The source material itself says, pretty explicitly, that 11 weeks is simply inadequate for extensive planning in the policy or process areas. In this short, really intense window, it seems to subject incoming administrations, particularly when power shifts between parties, to this predictable pattern of problems. The sources call it a 3-part transition syndrome: haste, hubris, and naivete.
Okay.
And we don't need to look back to the Civil War for examples. We see this vulnerability again and again in modern transitions. Take the Carter administration. They moved with such haste on the Panama Canal Treaty right after the election. But the incoming team hadn't really laid the political groundwork needed for ratification. They just weren't ready for the huge legislative fight that followed.
Right. That was a tough one.
Or look at the start of the Clinton administration, some of his early policy moves, like on gays in the military or handling Bosnia. They seemed driven mostly by campaign promises, that's the hubris part, and were made with very little consultation. It showed a real naivete about the governing process, about the political capital you actually need. The lack of time means administrations often get, quote, caught by surprise by events because they just haven't had those crucial months to build the infrastructure, get the right people in place, and set up policy coordination for this enormous government apparatus.
Okay, that's a compelling point about those policy stumbles and the whole transition syndrome idea. It certainly resonates as a behavioral pattern we've seen. But I would frame those issues differently. To me, they sound more like, well, managerial shortcomings, not fundamental structural failures of the Constitution.
Okay.
They're really serious dangers. The legal inability of someone like Lincoln or FDR to act during a massive crisis for 4 months, that was definitively solved by changing the date. The core problem wasn't really transition fragility, it was legal paralysis. The transition process now exists, it's defined, and it is manageable. I mean, look at Truman's transition for Eisenhower. It's often cited as a model transition. When an administration uses those 11 weeks effectively, the system works. The structural flaw is gone. And 11 weeks provides, I believe, sufficient time for competent governance to actually begin.
I understand the distinction you're making between the constitutional gap being closed and managerial competence. But let me push back on that a bit, because I think the managerial competence argument kind of overlooks the sheer scale and complexity of the modern executive branch. We're not just talking about a handful of appointments anymore. We're talking about staffing and integrating, over 4,000 political appointees across this vast, highly specialized bureaucracy?
It's a huge undertaking, no doubt.
Exactly. And scholars argue quite directly that the 11-week time frame is inherently inadequate for a new team, especially coming from the outside party, to really establish the procedures they need for policy guidance and coordination before they have to start making critical decisions. That short time frame almost guarantees that campaign rhetoric, which is always simplified, often disconnected from the messy reality of implementation, tends to override, quote, the realities of governing. And the lack of time means that really critical nuts and bolts stuff like personnel recruitment, background checks, vetting, it's often dangerously slow. The sources mention the Clinton transition again, where apparently very little progress was made on key personnel appointments during that pre-inauguration crunch because they just, ran out of time. You simply cannot staff the Pentagon, the State Department, the Treasury properly in that kind of rush. And the policy failures we talked about, they often follow directly from that initial institutional vacuum.
But couldn't you argue the opposite? If we accept that the transfer is inherently complex, wouldn't extending the window, say back towards 16 weeks, also increase the risk? The possibility of sabotage or just bureaucratic foot-dragging by the outgoing administration? 11 weeks seems like enough time for the essential logistics without giving the outgoing team too much time to, potentially undermine the incoming one. It feels like a balanced compromise.
It might be a compromise, but I argue it's one that leaves us perpetually vulnerable. And speaking of vulnerability, let's talk about another major goal of the 20th Amendment, trying to provide some structure for contingencies, for when things go really wrong.
Okay.
Section 4 of the amendment specifically gave Congress the power to legislate for, frankly, a terrifying scenario. What happens if a finalist in a contingent election, say the choice for president goes to the House? What happens if one of those finalists dies before the House makes its decision?
Right. A nightmare scenario.
Absolutely. Imagine the House is deadlocked between two candidates and one of them dies. Who's eligible then? What's the procedure? The potential for chaos is immense. And the source material is quite blunt. Congress has never passed such a law since the amendment was ratified in 1933.
That is surprising.
It's called unfortunate and dangerous in the analysis. And there's precedent that makes you shiver. Senator La Follette died back in 1925 while Congress was debating electoral reforms. If he had been a presidential nominee in a contingent election at that moment, his death could have sparked a genuine constitutional crisis. The amendment gave Congress the tool to secure the process against these foreseeable catastrophes. And the fact that Congress just hasn't acted, it really underscores for me the amendment's incompleteness in today's world.
That is a very powerful point about the legislative inaction on Section 4, and it definitely highlights a clear ongoing risk. I won't dispute that. However, I'm not sure that a later failure by Congress to use the power granted by Section 4 invalidates the core structural success of the amendment itself.
How so?
Well, we have to go back to the primary Democratic problem the amendment did solve. Senator Norris's committee report, it was all about eliminating the risk that a repudiated House, meaning one just defeated by the voters, would get to pick the next president. By seating the new Congress on January 3rd, 17 days before the inauguration, the power of that defeated outgoing House to choose the president is simply gone. That, to me, is the fundamental, successful structural fix. Yes, the risk of an election going to the House still exists, but now the decision rests with representatives who have a fresh mandate from the people. The amendment solved the Democratic deficit there. The lack of contingency planning since then is, I'd argue, a legislative oversight, not a flaw in the amendment's design.
But let's look at another Democratic deficit the amendment was supposed to fix. This whole issue of lame duck lawmaking. A key goal, as stated, was to abolish the so-called short session of Congress. That old session was seen as bad because it often led to illy considered legislation. You had defeated politicians who weren't facing the voters again, rushing bills through without accountability.
Right, the March 4th deadline created pressure.
Exactly. Now, while that specific session ending abruptly on March 4th is gone, we still have lame duck sessions. They now run from mid-November after the election until the new Congress convenes on January 3rd. That's still a decent chunk of time. And the source confirms these condensed lame duck sessions haven't lacked drama. It cites the impeachment of President Clinton in 1998 that happened during a post-election lame duck session. So the underlying problem, the Democratic concern about unaccountable officials passing laws or taking major political actions, it's still part of our system, even if the window is shorter. The original intention to eliminate it didn't fully succeed.
I think that might misinterpret the very specific historical problem the amendment was targeting. Its real goal and what it accomplished was getting rid of that time-limited second session that just slammed shut on March 4th. Creating legislative chaos.
Okay.
By shortening the overall term start and moving the assembly date to January 3rd, it removed those specific structural problems. Now, does lawmaking continue after an election? Yes. And is accountability always a concern then? Of course. But the amendment wasn't designed, nor could it really, bar any continuation of regular sessions after November. In fact, Senator Norris himself, the architect of the amendment, participated and voted in post-election sessions back in 1942. The risk of some unaccountable lawmaking was likely seen as maybe a lesser evil compared to the paralyzing power vacuum and the structural mess of the old short session. You can't really expect a constitutional amendment to mandate perfect political accountability. It can only fix the timelines and structures.
That distinction you draw between the constitutional fix and the subsequent managerial or political failures is useful, I grant you. But ultimately, it feels a bit like cold comfort when you look at the practical reality of governing today. The 20th Amendment, yes, it absolutely provided crucial historical relief from that awful 4-month vacuum. But by settling on what is now a very brief 11-week period for an executive branch that has grown exponentially in complexity, I think it effectively traded that old constitutional crisis of inaction for a recurring syndrome of internal policy failures. Failures rooted in that haste, hubris, and naivete we discussed. And the fact that Congress still hasn't addressed the specific contingency risks under Section 4, plus the persistence of unaccountable lame duck actions, it just highlights the ongoing fragility of presidential transitions, especially in the 21st century.
And I agree that operational challenges are real. They're probably inherent in any undertaking as massive and complex as handing over the keys to the U.S. government. However, I still maintain that structurally, the 20th Amendment was a profound and absolutely necessary success. It fundamentally corrected the most glaring democratic and governmental flaws of that old March 4th system. It eliminated the legal paralysis that literally threatened the Union during past crises. It provided, yes, only 11 weeks, but that's necessary time and crucially, perhaps, not too much time ensuring the people's mandate and the new government could actually take effect reasonably promptly on January 20th. I think the material makes it clear the 20th Amendment significantly restructured the flow of political power. And while it definitely achieved its main goal, reducing that long interlude of national impotence, it seems the debate continues, quite rightly, about the optimal length and the security needed for transitions under the ever-evolving pressures of modern governments. There's clearly more to scrutinize here.